So my project is audio separation comparison between clustering, repeating period, and hidden Markov model for my machine learning project. The input is the album version. The validation is the instrumental and the a cappella of a CD that's released in 1998. So the motivation is that audio separation could be enhanced by machine learning. Techniques could be validated with official versions of the separated audio, and we could listen to it, which is a different way to just plot the results. And then the best techniques could be applied towards audio where separation is unavailable for instrumental and a cappella versions. So for contemporary music, we have promotional CD singles in MP3 compressed. And the main version, we have to convert it into WAV file for it to be machine readable. And then for the output, we separate it by instrumental a cappella. Validation is the official instrumental a cappella, and the separation is a real-life application for making blend tapes or just listening to the instrumental a cappella individually. So contemporary music is created by layering and mixing vocals over instrumentals. This is Pro Tools on a Mac, and separation could be messy, and that's why we have to supervise it. Otherwise, we could isolate sounds by bass, drums, and hi-hats, but those sounds are already isolated. So that's why we want a collective harmony. And what makes it especially difficult is when someone manually changes the sound over time with a given manual procedure like this below. So when we plot the song spectrogram, the sound spectra is in 3D. So it's time, hertz, and decibels. So it's in a log scale, and the sound structure have texture, it has sharp outlines, and it has a full sound after the separation process. So this is the full sound, the full song. This is the official instrumental and the official a cappella for spectrograms. And then specifically for a 30-second sample, we could see that the decibels and hertz structure can maintain a similar magnitude across separated audio, meaning that it's around the same texture and is around the same magnitude. So we have to have a threshold allowance. So we could see that the horizontals are instrumentals and the curved squigglies are vocals, and it's not a simple subtraction where vocals are simply carved out. And you can see why, because the bad consequences of subtraction is that we can overcompensate for one output, which deteriorates the other output in quality. So when we overcompensate for instrumental, the a cappella is basically grainy, robotic, underwater, and the distance we could get into later, but it's 135 for this bad example and 285 for this bad example of a vocal separation. So to get distance, we basically have to convert it into a melt frequency cepstral coefficient. We first have to Fourier transform it. We have to map the frequency into pitch, and then we could do a discrete cosine transform. So basically it's time over time, and then we plot the path of the comparison, and it's the normalized difference. So the cost is basically the transform data, and then the path is how much this path deviates from the 45-degree angle. And even though, basically the data integrity is intact, but the units become abstract for this difference. So the song itself compared is 0. And the baseline test is basically comparing instrumental to song and a cappella to song for the separation technique. So the song and instrumental distance is 143, and the song to a cappella distance is 146. So if separation techniques are successful, it should be under 143, and then and should diminish to 0. So that's what we're looking for, something between 143 and 0 for the baseline test. So the separation of music is obviously mostly supervised, trained, because the isolated sounds exist and it's trivial and arbitrary. Also, we don't have a way to validate the separated results. So that's why machine learning is needed, and sound could be overlaid on top. Sound is overlaid on top of each other, and then structural integrity needs to be there as well. So we have the first method as clustering repeating period plus optimization, and the second is supervised hidden Markov model. So for clustering, it's basically we do the mapping again with the cost and the path, but this time we do the diagonals for pattern recognition, and then we plug it into a clustered for the machine to read it, so that it becomes a pattern for the full song, the instrumental, and the a cappella, and then we overlay that pattern recognition over the full spectrum, and then it looks like this. So obviously, the instrumental is very correlated with the full song if the instrumental is like really redundant, and we can increase the clusters to find the optimal repetition. So for the separation procedure, we only use the full song for the separation. So this procedure is basically we find the cluster to the optimal repetition, and then we take the median. So it optimizes at 6.9 seconds, and then to make an instrumental is basically the median overlaid on top of the full spectrogram to make an instrumental, and then we take it's how far the repeating spectrogram is allowed to repeat around the original. So there's a threshold of what's allowed to make the instrumental, and then the outliers of that threshold is the a cappella. So the instrumental is basically the threshold, and then the a cappella is the outside the threshold of the repeating instrumental. So threshold are not a pure subtraction separation. So the texture and the fullness and the quality of the sound is kept intact, and then it's like basically a take what you need method, and it's a repeat model. So the result is basically a close-up of the 30-second interval. This is the actual instrumental, and this is the separated instrumental, and then the distance is 98, and that's better than the baseline, it's 143. And we need time to optimize the parameters by ear. The margin is 1 for instrumental, and the a cappella is 0.5. And there's a fullness of the spectrum because of the median procedure. For the vocals, this is the actual vocals, this is the separated vocals. So the time, we still need time to do it, and it's 101. So it's better than 146. The margin is 1, and the a cappella margin is 0.6. There's still gaps in the spectrum despite the median threshold, but that's expected because we're taking the outliers from that median threshold to create the vocals. So this is another data set. It's called Multimedia Information Retrieval data set. There's 1,000 labeled a cappella, instrumental, or both in the form of WAV files. And it's in stereo. It's 4 to 13 seconds is male and female vocals. And we make a hidden Markov model for the spectral patterns with 70% training, 20% testing, and 10% validation. So to do this, we have a dictionary of labeled sounds from the original data set of the multimedia data set. And from that labeled dictionary, we permutate overlaying sounds together. And then we permutate sequencing sounds together. So that's the Markov model. And then we calculate the probability of transitioning between overlaying sounds together as well as sequencing sounds together. And then the hidden Markov model is used to find the transition probabilities of certain sequencing and certain overlays labeled sound. So it's a long iterative process depending on how big the data set is, and it's data augmentation from the original dictionary. So from there, once we find the probabilities, we use stepwise pattern alignment with the song spectra to validate by highest probability using the hidden Markov model. The transition states between vocals and instrumentals and overlaying can be isolated by subtraction with the match of what the hidden Markov model thinks it is, and then using the matched sound overlay, you just subtract it from the separated labels from the original multimedia data set, and then the results is dependent on the quality and diversity of the data set to basically recognize and then use by highest probability and then label it, and then from there figure out how to separate it by subtraction and labeling recognition. So from the trained hidden Markov model, the normalized distance is 100. It's very time intensive to label, train, and iterate. In this comparison, the clustering method wins by 98 over 100, and there's gaps in separation because of misinterpreted match probabilities. And then for the actual vocals, it still looks pretty full, but the distance is 111. And in this case as well, the clustering repeating method is better as well. And there's also misinterpreted match probabilities when it comes down to living and dying by the data set you trained with for the validation, and then for the modeling to predict what is what, and for the separation. So for conclusion, the best method is clustering repeating period with optimization. The pros is that it's fast, it's self-contained, but a sound file, it's limited by the sample, and it's manual optimization by ear. Supervised hidden Markov model with overlay and sequencing, it's really dependent on the data set, and it has weird separation with probabilistic matching. It's very time intensive with labeling, trailing, and iteration. So that's why clustering repeating period wins by time, results, and generality. And that's the comparison of the two different machine learning methods to separate sound from a cappella. That's it. Cool. Thanks.
Very cool. I did understand it. I found the results were interesting. There was a whole lot covered in the middle. There was a whole lot to cover in the middle there. Like the beginning and end were really good. The timing was good. It was it all made sense. It was just a whole lot was really covered in the middle. I know you're stretched for time, but I got lost a couple times. So I think that's just due to the format, not necessarily how it was presented. But it did make sense overall. So that's good.
For example, like where did you get stuck at? Or I just want to know, just for reference.
If you bring up the slides again, oh God.
I'm going to go in order. So,
keep going.
This is just introduction, and then the spectrogram graphing, and then the fullness and all that.
The first time I came to a spectrogram, it was a little hard for me because I just hadn't looked at a spectrogram before. I finally did get it for a couple examples.
That's true.
So that was good. And then keep going.
So the separated bad example.
That was good. That was very helpful.
This, I try to go through the math without showing any math. It was rough, but
This one was interesting to me. So it took me a second to understand, a little longer maybe. I was hoping to kind of figure out what this graph was showing. And I still don't know if I fully understand it. So what is it showing? I'm still kind of confused. I understand that the important part is this 45-degree line for the distance, but I'm still trying to figure out what, I guess, is this an idealized example right here, or?
This example is specifically for music or just audio in general, but technically it could be applied to other things. So, this is a perfect example of a 45-degree angle not deviating. So cosine, this is a cosine distance. So Euclidean is basically from point A to point B, what's the distance? Cosine is basically the difference between a perfect distance and like the deviation of the distance. So that's why it's called cosine distance. And then it's called normalized cosine distance. Basically, cosine can like wander left and right, but then like if you wander the same amount of left as the same amount of right, it goes to 0. So normalized makes it so that it's absolute value. So right here, there's like, I went fast, but it's a bunch of squigglies if you could kind of tell, but it deviates from that, and any sort of deviation is picked up by the normalized equation. And regardless if it travels like if it travels like a decently 45-degree angle, whatever's on top of whatever's on bottom is basically the additional scalar distance between the difference of the song and the instrumental. So that's why it's 143, and then this is 146. So, obviously, if it's a perfect match, it should be 0. That's what we're trying to aim for. And then there's going to be differences in the instrumental and the a cappella. And this is the baseline approach to understanding how to validate. Because, if you have a really bad distance, like 285, that's really bad separation. Like, you're left with, like, something that's worse off than the original song itself for retrieving what you were looking for. That's how, we want to diminish to zero, but it's really hard given the concept. Let me know if that makes any sense, or if I need to explain any more.
Yeah, that was really good. That was a great explanation.
Cool. And then, this is just explanation again. This is like trivial and like arbitrary. I made methods to like isolate drums and stuff, but it really, you could just have the drums itself and play, and then it's, that's why we need a collective harmony to make sense out of all this. And this is clustering, so I'm not sure if you got to clustering yet in your class. It's basically, the recurrence matrix. The recurrence matrix is basically plotting this again, but stressing diagonals. I should have said that, but basically, this is plotted on a nitty-gritty scale when it's like, it's all knitted. But the thing is, when you want to plot for redundancy, you just want to stress diagonals. So it's somewhat like any other statistical tool that you use. Like all the diagonals are really informative, while everything else is just there for show. So the diagonal makes it so that different clusters could be formatted, and then cluster 1, cluster 2, like different iterations of the clusters. It's just like it found, and then through the different iterations of clusters, you were able to find this like pattern with the 5 clusters, for example. And then you overlay it on top of the spectrum, and then obviously there's like a correlation between the instrumental and the song, as well as sometimes the a cappella as well. So, if that makes any sense, go from there as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next step. Oh yeah, I went kind of fast on this one. It's basically.
This one was.
Yeah, this one was tedious. So basically, from the clusters, we're basically saying that this repeats over a period of 6.9 seconds. From there, we take the median, because the instrumental for contemporary music is known to repeat over time. And the song, when you sing on top of it, it just deviates lows and highs and whatnot. So for like a music purist or anyone who knows a little bit of like contemporary music theory, it's basically the median spectrogram of the repeating redundancy of the song pretty much isolates the instrumental. That is just the ideal way to isolate instrumental. Just take the repeating redundancy and then say that's the redundancy, and then we could take a threshold, meaning that whatever is above a certain threshold or whatever below a certain threshold is allowed inside the instrumental. Otherwise, we could just do a flat subtraction where we're just like, this is what's allowed within the instrumental, and this is what's not allowed in the instrumental. And remember that this spectrogram is in 3D, so like whatever's like it's basically taking a slice, but the slice isn't like very horizontal. It's like it curves and molds itself around the repeating period. So that's why the mold of the median is molded around this allowed threshold of the original song to make the instrumental, for better or for worse, depending on how mature threshold is. You gotta like adjust by year. And then outside of that threshold, you could create a separate threshold or keep the same threshold to say whatever's outside of carving them or molding the median repeating spectrogram is the a cappella. So whatever you sing on top of it, or whatever additional vibes you get from it, is basically not the instrumental. This is a very simplified way to like adhere or like separate the thing, but basically that's how it separates by taking what's residual leftovers from that other threshold, or making a new threshold, and saying that's the a cappella. So that's how you separate it, by threshold and repeating period, and it's not pure subtraction. So let me know if that makes any sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did. That was really also a good explanation.
Yeah. So, and then for the cluster, this is just results. So, 98, which is decent, 150. And
yeah,
this
from
is the
here
margins.
it all makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, this is results again. And then this is just introduction of the second data set that I use. Okay, so hidden Markov model. Did that make any sense for permutation?
I was lost, but again, like I said, I'm quite tired.
That's fine.
And it was moving fast. So,
yeah, it was fast.
Yeah.
So, I mean, hidden Markov model is basically the transition. So, I mean, they always give like the weather transition. So, if there's like a 60% of rain today, what's the percent of rain tomorrow? So, like this transition between different weather is basically the probability of like guesswork, but based on like, so for example, if the weather makes you sad, and if you're sad for 2 straight days, what's the probability of you being sad the 2 straight days, and the probability of it being sunny? So, and then from there, you could apply it to other things. So, if there's like a permutation of sound overlay, and then there's a sequencing of sounds, what's the probability of it transitioning from acapella to instrumental, or overlaying acapella over instrumental? So, it's a definition in itself, but the transition between like changing it up, like it's basically steady state. Like how far does how much does it take for it to transition from one steady state to another steady state into equilibrium? The equilibrium meaning highest probability of matching. So through that equilibrium, we calculate all the equilibriums of like overlaying different sounds on top of each other for acapella and vocals, and it's basically we do overlays, and we can also do transitions between time. So there's 2 probability sequencing, and then from there, we try to align it with the song itself. So the alignment is basically, we classify this as vocals over instrumentals at this sequence, and then we do it until it ends per iteration. And then if it is, what does it look like? If it looks like this overlay of sound over this overlay of instrumentals, for example, what do we do to isolate each sound? So to isolate it is basically the biggest match, the highest probability match of an overlay of sound to instrumental, or of a vocal to instrumental, is basically what you do to subtract it. So if this sound sounds like this sound, and we know that this sound is a constituent of these 2 sounds, we basically say that this sound is a constituent of these 2 sounds, which is the vocals and the instrumental. And then it's a subtraction, unfortunately, but because it's like a very high level way of transitioning, it's either transition or an overlay, like the matching probability makes it so that whatever you're subtracting is a very high probability chance that it's this sound over that sound, and that's how you extract the different acapella from the different instrumental for a given time sequence. And then like how much it transitions from one to another sequence is basically doing the same thing over and over and over again, and it took a long time. So, I mean, hopefully that makes some sense. Let me know.
Yep.
Cool.
Good.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a mouthful, but yeah. And then this is the results. And then from there, it's like we're home free with, you live and die by the data set here, and then this is self-contained. But if you have a limited sample, you're kind of, you don't have enough to work with. So and then there's manual optimization. So this is like, you optimize it over and over again later, and this is, you train it beforehand. So you spend a lot of time training it, and you also spend a lot of time, iterating. And this is just like quick and snappy, but then you still have to listen by ear to figure out which one's the best way to have it separated. So those are the 2 methods I used. Cool.
Very cool.
Yeah, that's all.
Awesome.
All right, good luck, man. Talk to you later.
Thanks. Good luck.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.